Officer Clayton Briggs thought he was the undisputed king of Crestwood's affluent streets, wielding his badge like a weapon against anyone who didn't fit his narrow view of the neighborhood. When he spotted an elderly black man quietly reading on a park bench, Briggs saw an easy target to bully. He demanded obedience, slapped on cold steel handcuffs, and sneered, completely unaware that he had just arrested the one man capable of dismantling his entire career in a single afternoon. Sometimes, the universe delivers justice instantly, and Briggs was about to learn that arrogant prejudice comes with a devastating price. The morning air in Fairview Centennial Park was crisp and carried the faint, earthy scent of damp oak leaves and incoming autumn. It was a Tuesday, shortly after 9 o'clock, an hour when the sprawling, manicured lawns of Crestwood's most exclusive public space were mostly deserted. The park was a masterpiece of urban landscaping, featuring meandering cobblestone paths, weeping willows that draped elegantly over a pristine man-made lake, and wrought-iron benches dedicated to the city's historical figures. On one of these benches sat Elias Whitfield, a 72-year-old man who found his only true solace in the quiet ripples of the water. Elias was dressed impeccably, a habit ingrained in him over a lifetime of professional rigor. He wore a tweed jacket over a pressed pale blue button-down shirt, dark slacks, and polished leather loafers. A flat cap rested on his silver hair, shielding his deep brown eyes from the rising sun. In his weathered, heavily veined hands, he held a worn, leather-bound copy of The Count of Monte Cristo. Beside him on the bench sat a small paper bag containing crusts of artisanal bread, reserved strictly for the mallards that had come to recognize him over the past 3 years. Since the passing of his wife, Clara, the park had become Elias's sanctuary. It was where he felt closest to her memory. They had walked these very paths decades ago, when Crestwood was just an emerging suburb. A few hundred yards away, moving slowly along the perimeter road, was a sleek, black and white Crestwood Police Department cruiser. Behind the wheel sat Officer Clayton Briggs. Briggs was a man in his early 30s, heavily muscled, with a tight buzz cut and a perpetual scowl that masked a deep-seated insecurity. He had been on the force for 6 years, and in that time he had cultivated a reputation. Among his fellow officers, he was known as a hardliner, a cop who never let a minor infraction slide. But among the citizens who lived on the invisible borders of Crestwood's wealthy enclaves, Briggs was known as something much worse. He was a bully, a man who actively sought out confrontation, heavily relying on racial profiling to decide who belonged in his town and who did not. Briggs sipped his dark roast coffee, his eyes scanning the park with a predatory squint. He hated the morning shift. He preferred the adrenaline of the night, the flashing lights, the chase. Monitoring the quiet, wealthy neighborhoods was tedious. His radio crackled with mundane dispatch calls, a stray dog on Elm Street, a parking dispute near the local bakery. Briggs ignored them, cruising at a crawling 10 miles per hour, looking for something to break the monotony. As the cruiser rounded the gentle curve of Willow Drive, Briggs's eyes locked onto a figure sitting near the lake. He tapped the brakes, bringing the heavy vehicle to a slow, creeping halt. He rolled down his window, squinting through the morning glare. It was an older black man, sitting alone, reading a book. In the twisted, prejudiced machinery of Clayton Briggs's mind, a red flag immediately went up. Crestwood was an overwhelmingly affluent, predominantly white suburb. While the demographics had slowly begun to shift, Briggs still viewed anyone who didn't fit his specific, outdated mental image of a Crestwood resident with intense, unyielding suspicion. To Briggs, an elderly black man sitting idly in the park on a Tuesday morning was an anomaly that needed to be investigated, questioned, and ultimately removed. Probably casing the neighborhood, Briggs muttered to himself, the leather of his duty belt creaking as he shifted his weight. Or just loitering where he doesn't belong. Briggs threw the cruiser into park, the transmission clunking loudly in the quiet morning. He didn't bother to radio dispatch. In his mind, this wasn't an official call. This was just a routine clearing of the riffraff. He stepped out of the vehicle, adjusting his heavy utility belt, ensuring his radio, taser, and sidearm were all sitting exactly where he liked them. He slammed the car door shut with unnecessary force, the sound echoing across the still water of the lake and startling a flock of nearby sparrows into the sky. Elias heard the heavy, aggressive slam of the car door. He didn't flinch. He slowly turned his head, adjusting his reading glasses, and watched as the police officer began to march across the manicured grass toward him. Elias had lived a long, observant life. He knew the posture of a man looking for trouble. The officer's chest was puffed out, his thumbs resting on his belt, his strides long and heavy. It was a walk designed to intimidate, a physical projection of authority meant to make the recipient cower before a single word was spoken. Elias calmly placed a silk bookmark between the pages of Dumas' masterpiece and closed the book, resting it on his lap. He interlaced his fingers and waited, his expression neutral, his breathing steady. He had spent his entire life navigating rooms filled with aggressive, powerful men. A single, arrogant patrolman on a Tuesday morning was not going to break his peace. "Hey, you there!" Briggs barked, his voice loud enough to carry across the water, shattering the tranquil silence of the park. He stopped about 5 feet from the bench, towering over the seated elderly man. He planted his boots wide, crossing his massive arms over his chest. "What are you doing here?" Elias looked up, his eyes calmly assessing the badge, the nameplate that read Briggs, and the hostile sneer on the officer's face. "Good morning, officer," Elias replied, his voice a rich, gravelly baritone that commanded an effortless, quiet respect. "I am reading a book, and shortly I plan to feed the ducks." "Is that right?" Briggs sneered, unimpressed by the man's polite demeanor. In fact, the absolute lack of fear or deference in Elias's voice only irritated Briggs further. He was used to people stuttering, looking down, or immediately rushing to explain themselves when he approached. "You live around here?" "I do," Elias answered simply. "Where?" Briggs demanded, stepping closer, casting a shadow over Elias. "Give me an address." "With all due respect, Officer Briggs," Elias said, his tone remaining perfectly even. "I am simply sitting on a public park bench in the middle of the day. I am not committing a crime, nor am I disturbing the peace. Therefore, I have no obligation to provide you with my home address." Briggs's face flushed red, a dark, angry color rising from his thick neck. Nobody told him no, especially not someone he had already deemed beneath him. The tranquil morning was officially over. Briggs had found the confrontation he was looking for, and he was ready to make this old man regret ever stepping foot in Crestwood. The silence that followed Elias's refusal was heavy, suffocating the ambient sounds of the park. Even the ducks seemed to retreat further into the reeds, sensing the sudden, sharp spike in tension. Briggs uncrossed his arms and dropped his right hand to rest casually, yet threateningly, on the butt of his taser. It was an escalation tactic, a silent threat meant to force compliance. "Listen to me, old man," Briggs said, his voice dropping to a low, menacing growl. The thin veneer of professional policing had vanished instantly, replaced by raw, prejudiced intimidation. "We've had a string of burglaries in this neighborhood lately. People coming in from the city, looking for easy targets. Now I see you sitting here, scoping out the houses across the street. You're going to give me your ID right now, or we're going to have a serious problem." Elias did not look at the officer's hand on the weapon. He kept his gaze locked onto Briggs's eyes. The accusation was laughable. The houses across the street from the park were heavily gated estates, and Elias was sitting facing the lake with his back to the road. "Officer Briggs, there is a legal standard known as reasonable, articulable suspicion," Elias stated slowly, treating the angry cop as if he were a slow-learning student in a freshman lecture. "It is required for you to demand identification under the stop and identify statutes of this state. Sitting on a park bench reading French literature does not meet that standard. I will not be providing my identification." The use of legal terminology struck a raw nerve. Briggs hated sovereign citizen types, or anyone who thought they knew the law better than he did. "Oh, we got a park bench lawyer here," Briggs mocked, leaning in close enough that Elias could smell the stale coffee on his breath. "You think because you know a couple of fancy words you can disrespect a police officer? I am giving you a lawful order. Hand over your ID." "It is only a lawful order if it is backed by law," Elias replied smoothly. "And this is not. If you have no further business with me, I would appreciate it if you would step aside. You are blocking my sunlight." That did it. The absolute audacity of this elderly black man dismissing him pushed Briggs over the edge. In Briggs's distorted worldview, compliance was not optional. It was a mandatory tribute to his uniform. "Stand up!" Briggs yelled, his voice echoing sharply across the water. "Stand the hell up right now. You're under arrest." Elias sighed, a quiet, mournful sound for the loss of a beautiful morning. He carefully placed his book into his small leather satchel. He slowly rose to his feet. Despite his age, Elias stood at a respectable 6 feet tall, his posture straight and unyielding. He did not look intimidated. He looked profoundly disappointed. "On what charge, officer?" Elias asked calmly. "Loitering, disturbing the peace, interfering with a police investigation. Take your pick, buddy." "Turn around and put your hands behind your back," Briggs commanded, unclipping the steel handcuffs from his belt. As Elias turned around and placed his hands behind his back, a voice called out from the paved walking path about 30 feet away. "Hey, what are you doing? Leave that man alone." Briggs snapped his head around. A woman in her mid-30s, wearing expensive jogging gear and holding a golden retriever on a leash, had stopped on the path. Her name was Evelyn Harper, a local resident who walked the park every morning. She had her smartphone out, the camera lens pointed directly at Briggs. "Keep moving, lady. This is official police business," Briggs shouted, pointing a thick accusatory finger at her. "He's an old man feeding the ducks," Evelyn yelled back, taking a step closer, ensuring she was capturing the interaction. "I see him here every week. He hasn't done anything wrong. Why are you arresting him?" "I said back off, or I'll arrest you for obstruction," Briggs roared, his face now a mask of pure, uncontrolled rage. The presence of a camera made his heart race, but his ego refused to back down. To retreat now would be a public humiliation. He turned his attention back to Elias, grabbing the older man's wrists with excessive, brutal force. Briggs slammed the cold steel cuffs onto Elias's wrists, clicking them shut tightly. "You see what you're doing?" Briggs hissed into Elias's ear. "You're causing a scene. You're causing a public disturbance." "The only disturbance here, Officer Briggs, is the one you brought with you," Elias replied softly. Despite the sharp pain of the tight metal biting into his skin, his voice never wavered. "I highly recommend you think very carefully about your next steps. You are crossing a line from which you will not be able to return." "Shut up!" Briggs snapped, grabbing Elias roughly by the bicep and pushing him forward toward the cruiser. "I make the rules out here. You're going to the precinct, and you're going to sit in a cell until you learn some respect." Evelyn Harper continued to film as Briggs shoved the dignified elderly man toward the patrol car. "I'm sending this to the news," she yelled after them. "I'm calling the mayor's office. You're out of control." Briggs ignored her, shoving Elias against the side of the cruiser, roughly patting him down. He found a leather wallet in Elias's back pocket and snatched it out, tossing it onto the hood of the car. He didn't even bother to open it, to look at the ID he had just been demanding. He was running purely on adrenaline and spite now. He opened the back door of the cruiser and practically threw Elias into the hard plastic back seat. Slamming the door shut, Briggs marched around to the driver's side, snatched the wallet off the hood, and got in. He tossed the wallet onto the passenger seat. He keyed his radio, his breathing heavy. "Dispatch, this is Unit 4. I've got one in custody, transporting to the precinct." "Copy, Unit 4, the dispatcher replied mechanically. "What are the charges?" Briggs paused, staring at Elias through the rear-view mirror. Elias was sitting upright, his face an unreadable mask of calm. Failure to identify, loitering and resisting arrest." "Copy that. We'll have processing ready." Briggs threw the car into drive and sped away from the park, tires screeching slightly on the asphalt. He looked in the mirror again, a triumphant, ugly smirk twisting his lips. "You should have just shown me your ID, old man. Could have saved yourself a lot of trouble." Elias looked out the window at the passing trees, watching the beautiful park fade from view. "The trouble, Officer Briggs," Elias said quietly, "has not even begun." The drive to the Crestwood Police Precinct took exactly 12 minutes. For Clayton Briggs, it was a victory lap. He drove slightly over the speed limit, enjoying the hum of the engine and the satisfying knowledge that he had successfully exerted his dominance over the elderly man in the back seat. He turned up the radio, playing a classic rock station, occasionally glancing in the rearview mirror to gloat. Elias Whitfield, however, remained completely silent. The handcuffs were tight, pinching the delicate skin of his wrists, sending dull aches up his forearms. Yet his mind was entirely focused elsewhere. He wasn't thinking about the indignity of the arrest or the physical discomfort. He was analytically processing the situation, mapping out the cascade of consequences that were about to fall upon the arrogant officer driving the car. Elias had spent 45 years of his life dedicated to the law. He had served as a defense attorney, a prosecutor, and finally, for 2 decades, as a justice on the state Supreme Court. He knew every statute, every civil rights violation, and every procedural failure Briggs had committed in the span of 10 minutes. More importantly, Elias Whitfield was not just a retired judge. He was a pillar of the Crestwood community, albeit a deeply private one. His late wife, Clara, had been the heiress to the Crestwood founding family. Through their philanthropic trust, Elias owned large swaths of commercial and public real estate in the city. The very precinct Briggs was currently driving him to, a state-of-the-art facility built 5 years ago, sat on land that Elias owned and leased to the city for exactly $1 a year. The Fairview Centennial Park? Elias had personally funded the landscaping renovations in Clara's memory. Briggs was completely oblivious. He saw only an old man who had dared to challenge his authority. "I hope you've got bail money," Briggs taunted as they pulled into the back lot of the precinct, "because the judge is going to throw the book at you for resisting. They don't take kindly to people messing with cops in this town." Elias allowed himself a small, almost imperceptible smile. The judge, he thought. How delightfully ironic. Briggs parked the cruiser, killed the engine, and stepped out. He opened the rear door and yanked Elias out by the arm, eager to parade his catch through the bullpen. "Let's go, nice and easy. Try anything, and you'll end up on the pavement." Elias stepped out smoothly, maintaining his balance, despite having his hands bound. He walked with his head held high as Briggs escorted him through the heavy metal back doors of the precinct and down the brightly lit hallway toward the booking desk. The Crestwood precinct bullpen was busy. Phones were ringing, officers were typing reports at their desks, and a couple of low-level offenders were sitting on a wooden bench, looking miserable. Behind the elevated booking desk stood Desk Sergeant Thomas O'Malley. O'Malley was a 20-year veteran, a stout, red-faced man who knew the law, knew the neighborhood, and crucially, knew exactly who pulled the strings in Crestwood. "Hey, Sarge," Briggs called out loudly, projecting his voice so the rest of the room could hear. He marched Elias up to the desk. "Got a live one. Refused to ID, caused a disturbance at the park, gave me a hard time." Sergeant O'Malley was looking down at his computer screen, typing a report. "Name?" he asked without looking up. "He wouldn't give it to me," Briggs said, pulling Elias's leather wallet from his pocket and tossing it onto the high counter. "But his wallet is right there. Process him for loitering, failure to ID, and resisting." O'Malley sighed heavily, clearly annoyed by Briggs's constant stream of petty arrests. He reached out, grabbed the wallet, and flipped it open. He pulled out the driver's license, sliding it out of the plastic sleeve. "Let's see who we have here," O'Malley mumbled, his eyes scanning the card. First, he read the name, Whitfield, Elias James. O'Malley's typing fingers froze. He blinked rapidly, thinking his eyes were playing tricks on him. He looked at the address. It was the massive, gated historic estate on the edge of the park. The Whitfield estate. Slowly, agonizingly, Sergeant O'Malley lifted his head to look at the man standing in handcuffs in front of his desk. He looked at the impeccably tailored tweed jacket, the silver hair, and the calm, authoritative brown eyes that were currently staring right back at him. All the color drained from Sergeant O'Malley's face. His jaw actually went slack. The bustling noise of the precinct seemed to fade away into a muted buzz in his ears. "Holy Mother of God," O'Malley whispered, his voice trembling. Briggs, mistaking O'Malley's shock for something else, puffed out his chest. Yeah, he thought he was a tough guy, spouting off about legal statutes and reasonable suspicion. I had to put him in his place. O'Malley didn't look at Briggs. He couldn't. His eyes were locked in sheer terror on Elias. He immediately slammed his hand down on the counter and practically vaulted out from behind the high desk. He scrambled down the short flight of stairs to the bullpen floor, his keys jingling frantically on his belt. "Sergeant?" Briggs asked, finally sensing that something was wrong. "What are you doing?" O'Malley shoved Briggs roughly out of the way. "Move!" he barked, his voice cracking with panic. O'Malley rushed to Elias's side, his hands shaking as he fumbled with his handcuff keys. "Justice Whitfield, sir, I don't even know what to say. I am so incredibly sorry. Please, let me get these off you, immediately." The click of the handcuffs unlocking echoed loudly in the suddenly quiet bullpen. Several officers had stopped typing and were now staring at the scene unfolding. Briggs stood frozen, a deep frown lines creasing his forehead. "Justice? What are you talking about, Sarge? This guy is a vagrant." O'Malley spun around, his face turning a violent shade of purple. "Shut your mouth, Briggs. Just shut your damn mouth right now." O'Malley roared, spit flying from his lips. He turned back to Elias, gently taking the steel cuffs away and stepping back, his posture entirely submissive. "Sir, are you injured? Do you need medical attention?" Elias brought his arms forward, slowly rubbing his raw, indented wrists. He adjusted the cuffs of his shirt and smoothed his jacket. He looked at O'Malley with a gaze that was neither angry nor forgiving. It was simply judicial. "I am physically uninjured, Sergeant O'Malley," Elias said, his voice echoing in the dead silence of the room, "though I cannot say the same for my faith in the Crestwood Police Department." Briggs felt a cold sweat break out on the back of his neck. His stomach plummeted as a horrible realization began to claw its way into his brain. He looked at O'Malley, then at the old man. "Sarge, who is this?" Briggs asked, his voice suddenly small and hollow. Before O'Malley could answer, the heavy oak door to the captain's office swung open. Captain Richard Hayes, the commanding officer of the precinct, stepped out, holding a coffee mug. He took one look at the scene. Briggs looking terrified, O'Malley sweating profusely, and Elias Whitfield rubbing his wrists in the middle of the bullpen floor. Captain Hayes dropped his coffee mug. It shattered on the linoleum, hot coffee splattering everywhere. But nobody moved. "Justice Whitfield," Captain Hayes breathed, his face turning as pale as O'Malley's. What in God's name is happening here?" Elias turned to face the captain. He didn't raise his voice, but every word he spoke landed like a hammer blow in the silent room. "Captain Hayes," Elias said calmly, "it appears your officer here, Mr. Briggs, decided that my presence on a park bench on my own property was an affront to his authority. He has unlawfully detained me, assaulted me, and brought me here under threat of imprisonment." Elias slowly turned his head to look directly into the terrified eyes of Clayton Briggs. "Officer Briggs," Elias said softly, the weight of his absolute power finally making itself known. "I told you that you were crossing a line from which you couldn't return. You're about to find out exactly what that means." The silence in the Crestwood precinct bullpen was absolute, broken only by the steady drip of Captain Richard Hayes's spilled coffee pooling on the linoleum floor. Every officer, civilian clerk and petty offender in the room stared at the tableau unfolding near the booking desk. The balance of power had violently shifted in the span of 30 seconds, and the aftershocks were actively crumbling the foundation of Officer Clayton Briggs's entire reality. Captain Hayes stepped carefully over the shattered ceramic of his mug, his eyes fixed on the bruised wrists of the elderly man standing before him. Hayes had been a patrolman in Crestwood 25 years ago. He knew exactly who Elias Whitfield was. He knew that the Whitfield Family Trust had anonymously covered the medical bills for 3 officers injured in the line of duty last decade. He knew that Elias had served with ruthless impartiality on the state Supreme Court. And he knew, with a sickening certainty, that Briggs had just detonated a career-ending bomb inside his precinct. "Justice Whitfield," Captain Hayes repeated, his voice remarkably steady despite the pallor of his skin. "I cannot express the depth of my horror at seeing you in these circumstances. Please come into my office. We will handle this immediately." Elias did not move. He stood tall, his posture a testament to decades of presiding over courtrooms where he commanded absolute authority. "I will not be going into your office, Captain. What happened today occurred in a public space, under the color of public law. It will be addressed in the public eye, right here." Briggs swallowed hard. His throat felt like sandpaper. He tried to speak, to offer some pathetic justification, but the words withered on his tongue. He looked at Sergeant O'Malley, desperately seeking a lifeline, an ally in the Brotherhood of Blue. O'Malley wouldn't even meet his gaze, instead staring intently at the floor, his face flushed with secondary embarrassment and fear. "Officer Briggs," Captain Hayes snapped, his voice cracking like a whip. The sudden volume made several officers jump. "Step forward." Briggs hesitated, then took 2 stiff steps toward his commanding officer. His heart was hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs. "You detained and arrested this man. On what grounds?" Hayes demanded, his eyes boring into Briggs. He was loitering, Captain," Briggs stammered, his usual bravado entirely evaporated. "There have been burglaries." He refused to provide identification when asked. I was conducting a field interview based on reasonable suspicion." Elias let out a sound that was half sigh, half scoff. It was a terrifyingly quiet noise. "Reasonable suspicion," Elias echoed, the words rolling off his tongue with practiced legal precision. "Captain Hayes, I was sitting on a bench, dedicated to my late wife Clara, reading Alexandre Dumas. I was 50 yards from the nearest roadway and facing a lake. If your officer considers a septuagenarian reading a classic novel to be a precursor to a residential burglary, then your department is suffering from a catastrophic failure of training or a profound infection of prejudice. I suspect it is the latter." Captain Hayes didn't need to hear another word. He had dealt with complaints about Briggs before, always borderline, always aggressively defended by the Union, always involving minorities passing through Crestwood. But this was different. This was unspinnable. "Officer Briggs," Hayes said, his tone dropping to a lethal, quiet register. "Take out your weapon and place it on Sergeant O'Malley's desk. Then your taser. Then your badge." The words hit Briggs like a physical blow. Stripping an officer of their badge and gun in the middle of the bullpen, in front of their peers, was the ultimate humiliation. It was a maneuver reserved for the most egregious, undeniable offenses. "Captain, please," Briggs pleaded, his voice cracking. "Let me explain. It was a misunderstanding. I didn't know who he was." "That is precisely the problem, Officer Briggs," Elias interjected, his voice finally rising, echoing off the high ceiling. The sheer force of his reprimand commanded the room. "You did not know who I was. You saw an elderly black man, and you assumed I was a vagrant, a criminal, or a threat. You felt entitled to bypass the Constitution because you believed my skin color afforded me fewer protections. If I were a retired sanitation worker instead of a retired Supreme Court justice, I would currently be locked in one of your holding cells. Your ignorance of my identity is not your defense. It is your damnation." Briggs's hands shook visibly as he unholstered his service weapon, cleared the chamber, and placed it heavily on the high counter. He followed it with his bright yellow taser. Finally, with trembling fingers, he unpinned the silver Crestwood police badge from his chest and laid it next to his weapons. The metallic clink seemed to echo forever. "You are suspended immediately, without pay, pending a full internal and criminal investigation," Captain Hayes stated. "You will leave this building now, and you will not return unless summoned by internal affairs." As Briggs turned, completely stripped of his armor and his unearned authority, the precinct doors swung open. Mayor Thomas Linden, a meticulously groomed politician who usually never left his downtown office before noon, burst through the doors. He was flanked by his chief of staff and looking utterly frantic. "Captain Hayes!" Mayor Linden shouted, his eyes scanning the room until they locked onto Elias. The mayor practically sprinted across the linoleum. "Justice Whitfield! Good God, Elias, are you all right?" Captain Hayes looked confused. "Mayor, how did you know about this? It just happened." The mayor pulled out his smartphone, his face twisted in a grimace of absolute disaster. "How do I know? The whole damn world knows, Richard. A woman named Evelyn Harper was walking her dog. She filmed the entire interaction. She posted it online 10 minutes ago, and it's already been picked up by the regional news networks. My office phones are ringing off the hook. They're calling him the Crestwood bully." Briggs stopped dead in his tracks. The camera, the jogger. He had been so blinded by his own arrogance that he had dismissed her entirely. He watched as Mayor Linden hit play on his phone, turning the screen toward Captain Hayes. The tinny audio of the phone speaker projected Briggs's own voice back at him, loud and aggressive. "I make the rules out here. You're going to the precinct, and you're going to sit in a cell until you learn some respect." The video clearly showed Elias, calm and dignified, being violently shoved against the cruiser by a red-faced, out-of-control officer. It was a textbook display of police brutality and racial profiling, captured in high definition. Briggs felt his knees go weak. The room began to spin. He wasn't just fired. He was a national pariah. "Elias, I am so deeply sorry," Mayor Linden babbled, trying to do damage control. "We will settle this. We will make it right. Whatever you need, the city will provide." Elias Whitfield buttoned his tweed jacket, his expression hardening into a mask of pure, unyielding resolve. "I do not need your apologies, Thomas, and I certainly do not need a settlement from the city taxpayers to cover the sins of a rogue officer. What I need is accountability." Elias turned his piercing gaze toward Briggs, who was practically shrinking into the floor near the exit. "I have spent my entire life upholding the law," Elias said, addressing the entire room now. "I will not allow men who wear that badge to desecrate it. Officer Briggs, you told me I was going to learn respect. Instead, I am going to teach you the true weight of the justice system you so flippantly abuse." Elias turned and walked out of the precinct, leaving a shattered, breathless room in his wake. Clayton Briggs pushed through the heavy glass doors a moment later, walking out into the harsh morning sunlight, knowing his life as he knew it was officially over. Within 48 hours, the life of Clayton Briggs had been systematically dismantled. The video captured by Evelyn Harper had not just gone viral, it had become a cultural flashpoint. National news anchors played the clip on loop, dissecting Briggs's aggressive posture, his immediate escalation, and his blatant disregard for the law. The hashtag Stand With Elias trended worldwide, but Elias Whitfield himself refused all interview requests. He did not want celebrity. He wanted a surgical, flawless legal strike. Briggs sat in the sterile, windowless conference room of the local Fraternal Order of Police headquarters. He was wearing civilian clothes, a grey hoodie and jeans, and he looked like he hadn't slept in days. Dark circles bruised the skin under his eyes, and he kept picking at his fingernails. Across the table sat David Corcoran, the seasoned union representative known for getting officers out of impossible situations. Corcoran was reviewing a thick manila folder. He closed it slowly, took off his reading glasses, and pinched the bridge of his nose. "It's bad, Clay," Corcoran said bluntly, devoid of his usual confident bluster. "It's a slaughter." "Come on, Dave," Briggs pleaded, leaning forward. "The union has to back me. I have rights. It was a bad stop, I'll admit it. But I didn't beat him. I didn't draw my weapon. A suspension? Sure. But they're talking about taking my pension. They're talking about putting you in a federal penitentiary, Clay," Corcoran corrected him, his voice grim. "Do you understand who you arrested? Elias Whitfield wrote the state guidelines on probable cause and civil rights protections during his time on the bench. He isn't suing the city for a quick, multi-million-dollar payout. That's what a normal victim would do. Whitfield has filed a meticulously documented complaint with the Department of Justice, the State Attorney General, and the local district attorney." Corcoran opened the folder again and slid a document across the table. "District Attorney Robert Hughes called me this morning. He is formally convening a grand jury. They are going after you for false imprisonment, assault under the color of law, and official oppression. And because of the racial element clearly documented in your history—" "My history is clean," Briggs interrupted defensively. "Don't lie to me, Clay," Corcoran snapped, slamming his hand on the table. "Internal Affairs has reopened every single complaint filed against you in the last 6 years. And guess what? When a retired Supreme Court justice puts a spotlight on a precinct, people start talking. 7 different minority residents of Crestwood have come forward in the last 2 days with corroborating stories of you unlawfully detaining them, harassing them, and threatening them without cause. The precinct swept it under the rug because those people didn't have the money or power to fight back. Elias Whitfield does. Briggs stared at the legal documents, the dense paragraphs of statutes and penal codes blurring together. A cold, suffocating panic gripped his chest. He had always relied on the blue wall of silence to protect him. He believed his badge was a shield against consequences, but the wall was crumbling, and his shield had been taken away. "What do I do, Dave?" Briggs whispered, his voice trembling. "What's the play?" "The play is survival," Corcoran said coldly. "The union is pulling its legal funding for your defense." Briggs shot up out of his chair. "What? You can't do that! I pay my dues." "Your actions have brought catastrophic disrepute to this department," Corcoran replied, not flinching. "We protect cops who make mistakes in the heat of a dangerous moment. We do not protect bullies who manufacture crimes to stroke their own egos, especially when they catch it on 4K video. You're on your own, Clay. You need to hire a private defense attorney, and you need to pray Hughes offers you a plea deal that doesn't involve a decade in prison." The next day, Briggs faced the Internal Affairs Division. Detective Sarah Jenkins, a relentless investigator who despised dirty cops, led the interview. Briggs sat in the interrogation room, his private attorney, a tired-looking man he had retained by maxing out his credit cards, sitting silently next to him. "Let's review the tape again, Mr. Briggs," Detective Jenkins said, her tone dripping with professional disdain. She hit play on a laptop facing him. The audio filled the small room. "You think because you know a couple of fancy words you can disrespect a police officer?" Jenkins paused the video. "Mr. Briggs, can you explain to me what fancy words Justice Whitfield used that constituted a criminal offense?" Briggs swallowed hard. He was citing legal statutes to confuse me." "He was citing the law, Mr. Briggs," Jenkins corrected sharply. "A law you swore an oath to uphold. He informed you that you lacked reasonable, articulable suspicion, a concept taught in week 2 of the police academy. Did you possess reasonable, articulable suspicion that a crime had been, was being, or was about to be committed?" I thought he was casing the neighborhood," Briggs mumbled. "Based on what facts?" Jenkins pressed. "Was he carrying burglary tools? Was he looking into windows? Or was he simply a black man sitting in a wealthy neighborhood reading a book?" Briggs looked at his lawyer, who subtly shook his head. "I exercise my right to remain silent," Briggs muttered. "You can remain silent all you want," Jenkins said, closing her laptop with a sharp snap. "But the evidence screams. Your career is over, Briggs. We are officially recommending your decertification to the state board. You will never wear a badge in this state or any other state, ever again. And DA Hughes is preparing the arrest warrants as we speak." Karma had not just knocked on Clayton Briggs's door, it had kicked it off the hinges. The life he had built on a foundation of intimidation and prejudice was collapsing with terrifying speed. He had thought he was the apex predator of Crestwood's parks. Instead, he had willingly walked into a trap of his own making, locking the cuffs onto his own wrists. As Briggs left the IA building, navigating a sea of reporters shouting questions and flashing cameras in his face, he realized the ultimate, devastating truth. Elias Whitfield hadn't needed to raise his voice, throw a punch, or resist. He had simply let Briggs's own arrogance destroy him. The Crestwood County Courthouse was a towering monolith of grey stone and classical columns, an architectural monument to the very laws Clayton Briggs had so casually disregarded. 6 months had passed since the incident at Fairview Centennial Park. Autumn had surrendered to a bitter, unforgiving winter, mirroring the chill that had permanently settled into Briggs's life. He was no longer a proud, intimidating patrolman. Stripped of his badge, his union backing, and his income, He was a hollowed-out defendant, facing the crushing weight of the state. Inside courtroom 302, the air was thick with tension. Every wooden bench in the gallery was packed with reporters, civil rights advocates, and Crestwood residents. District Attorney Robert Hughes, a sharp, unyielding prosecutor with a reputation for political ambition, stood at the podium. He wasn't just trying a bad cop, he was trying the very culture of the Crestwood Police Department, with the entire nation watching. Briggs sat rigidly at the defense table next to his attorney, Leonard Gable. Gable was a competent but exhausted public tier defense lawyer, the only representation Briggs could afford after liquidating his meager savings. Briggs wore a cheap, ill-fitting grey suit. His closely cropped hair had grown out into an unkempt mess, and his hands trembled slightly as they rested on the polished oak table. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," D.A. Hughes began, his voice echoing in the cavernous room. "The defense will try to tell you that what happened on that Tuesday morning was a mistake. A momentary lapse in judgment by an overzealous officer trying to protect his community. They will use words like protocol and suspicion. But the evidence you will see and hear today will prove, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that Clayton Briggs was not protecting Crestwood. He was terrorizing it." Hughes masterfully laid out the timeline. He brought Evelyn Harper to the stand. The jogger confidently recounted the sheer, unprovoked aggression she witnessed, explaining how Briggs threatened her with arrest simply for holding a camera. The viral video was played on a large screen, the audio of Briggs's sneering voice filling the courtroom. Briggs flinched, unable to look at the screen, staring instead at his shaking hands. But the true twist of the trial, the devastating legal maneuver that Gable hadn't anticipated, came on the second day of proceedings. D.A. Hughes didn't just rely on the Park incident. Through a series of grueling pre-trial motions, Hughes had successfully petitioned the judge to allow pattern of practice evidence. Hughes called 3 unexpected witnesses to the stand. The first was a Hispanic delivery driver, whom Briggs had detained for an hour without cause. The second was a black college student whose car Briggs had illegally searched, threatening to plant narcotics if the boy didn't stop mouthing off. The third was a young Middle Eastern architect who had been handcuffed for taking photos of a commercial building he had designed. With each testimony, the jury's faces hardened. Briggs wasn't just a cop who made a single mistake. He was a serial abuser of power who used his badge as a weapon of prejudice. Then on the third day, Elias Whitfield took the stand. A hushed, reverent silence fell over the courtroom as the elderly man walked slowly to the witness box. He wore a perfectly tailored charcoal suit. He did not look angry, nor did he look like a victim. He looked exactly like what he was, a retired Supreme Court justice who understood the absolute sanctity of the law. Under Hughes's gentle questioning, Elias recounted the morning with surgical precision. He explained the legal definitions of reasonable suspicion and probable cause, dissecting Briggs's actions not just morally, but legally. Leonard Gable stood up for cross-examination, looking like a man walking to his own execution. He knew he couldn't attack Elias's character. "Justice Whitfield," Gable started nervously, "is it not possible that Officer Briggs, in the heat of the moment, genuinely believed you matched the description of a suspect, that he was acting out of a misguided sense of duty rather than malice?" Elias adjusted his glasses, looking down at Gable from the elevated witness stand. "Mr. Gable, duty requires a foundation of fact. Malice requires only a foundation of prejudice. There were no burglaries reported in that precinct that morning. I matched no description other than the color of my skin. Officer Briggs did not ask for my name to ascertain my identity. He demanded my obedience to validate his ego. When an officer of the law bypasses the Constitution Because he feels entitled to subjugate a citizen, that is not a mistake, Counselor. That is official oppression. Gable swallowed hard, nodded, and sat down. He had nothing else. The final, fatal blow came during the prosecution's closing arguments. D.A. Hughes introduced a piece of evidence Briggs thought didn't exist, the dash-cam audio from the cruiser before Briggs stepped out. Briggs had assumed the microphone was off, but the rolling cache system had captured the 60 seconds prior to the flashing lights activating. The audio crackled over the courtroom speakers. The jury heard the hum of the cruiser's engine, and then Briggs's own voice, muttered under his breath as he spotted Elias from afar. "Look at this guy. Doesn't belong here. Probably casing the neighborhood. I'm gonna run this piece of trash out of my park." A collective gasp echoed through the gallery. Briggs closed his eyes, a single tear of absolute ruin sliding down his cheek. He had convicted himself before he ever stepped out of the car. There was no defense of suspicion anymore. It was premeditated, racially motivated harassment. The trap had closed tight. The jury deliberation was stunningly brief. In less than 3 hours they returned to the courtroom. Clayton Briggs stood, his legs feeling like lead. He looked toward the gallery, hoping to see a sympathetic face from his former precinct. Not a single police officer was there to support him. The blue wall had abandoned him the moment his toxicity threatened the entire department. The foreperson handed the slip of paper to the bailiff, who passed it to the presiding judge, Honorable Harrison Carter. Judge Carter read the verdict in silence, his expression grim, before handing it back to the clerk. On the charge of false imprisonment, how do you find? Guilty. On the charge of assault under the color of law, how do you find? Guilty. On the charge of official oppression, how do you find? Guilty. Briggs collapsed back into his chair, the breath knocked out of him, as if he had been physically struck. Gable didn't even pat his shoulder. The lawyer simply began packing his briefcase. Judge Carter leaned forward, looking directly at Briggs. "Mr. Briggs, I have sat on this bench for 20 years. I have profound respect for the difficult job law enforcement officers perform daily. But you are a disgrace to the uniform you once wore. You took an oath to protect the vulnerable and uphold the Constitution. Instead, you acted as a tyrant in a taxpayer-funded cruiser. You targeted Justice Whitfield because you believed he was powerless. The profound irony is that you chose to victimize the one man who had the power to dismantle your corruption entirely." Judge Carter struck his gavel. "I sentence you to 48 months in a federal penitentiary. You are permanently decertified as a law enforcement officer, and pursuant to state law regarding felony convictions under the color of law, your pension is hereby revoked. Bailiff, remand the defendant into custody." 2 county sheriffs approached the defense table. Briggs, pale and trembling, slowly put his hands behind his back. The sharp, metallic click of the handcuffs echoing in the silent courtroom was a sound Briggs knew intimately. But this time, the cold steel was biting into his own wrists. The karma was absolute, instantaneous, and inescapable. As Briggs was led out of the courtroom, his eyes briefly met Elias's in the gallery. Elias did not smile. He did not gloat. He simply offered a slow, deliberate nod, an acknowledgement that justice, though sometimes delayed by systemic rot, had finally been served. In the months that followed, Crestwood underwent a massive transformation. The police department, under intense scrutiny and threat of federal receivership, was completely overhauled. Captain Hayes took early retirement. The city instituted mandatory, rigorous de-escalation and implicit bias training, overseen by an independent civilian board. The funding for that civilian oversight board came from a massive, multi-million-dollar grant provided by the Clara Whitfield Foundation. Elias Whitfield returned to his quiet life. On a crisp, sunny Tuesday morning, exactly 1 year after the incident that changed the city, Elias walked back into Fairview Centennial Park. The manicured lawns were green, the weeping willows swayed gently in the breeze, and the ducks paddled peacefully in the man-made lake. Elias walked down the cobblestone path and took his seat on the wrought-iron bench dedicated to his late wife. He opened his leather satchel, pulled out a worn copy of French literature, and placed a small paper bag of artisanal bread crusts beside him. A local patrol officer on a bicycle rode past on the perimeter path. The officer slowed down, offered a polite, respectful wave, and kept riding. Elias smiled softly, opened his book, and began to read, finally left in peace. The story of Clayton Briggs and Elias Whitfield serves as a stark, dramatic reminder that true power does not roar, and genuine authority does not demand submission through fear. Briggs's catastrophic downfall was not merely a stroke of bad luck. It was the inevitable collision of unchecked arrogance and profound prejudice meeting an immovable wall of justice. He weaponized his badge against a man he deemed beneath him, only to discover that the law is not a shield for the cruel, but a sword for the righteous. Karma, in this case, was not some mystical force, but the swift, methodical dismantling of a corrupt life by a system working exactly as it should. Ultimately, the park bench transformed from a site of intimidation into a lasting monument of civil rights, proving that dignity, when challenged, will always outlast the fleeting, hollow threats of a bully.